Hello everybody and welcome back to Inclusive Leadership. Just a reminder, Inclusive Leadership is a class designed with 3 goals in mind. Develop students' individual approach to change making and leadership, develop empathy, and develop problem solving skills. And every week we look at either a system or we look at a structure, and we also look at skills. And today we're looking at a system called foster care. And our hope is that we can dig into this system and learn a little bit about it, look at some of its pitfalls and the ways that it's oppressive, and the ways that power and privilege and human rights all play a role in it. And our goal of this class ultimately is to create well-rounded young leaders that can apply their skills to any system, career, ambition, or life circumstance with clear and guiding vision that includes the marginalized. And joining me today to look at the foster care system is Ray. Everybody welcome Ray.
Hi. Nice to meet you guys over podcast or whatever this is.
Yeah. For confidentiality purposes and the population that she's working with, we're not going to use her legal name, and she's going to not share the location of where she works or the kids that she works with, obviously. But she is a therapist and a social worker with within the Washington State foster care system through an agency that's associated with DCYF. And I'm not going to describe that because I will do a poor job, but I will have Ray describe it as we go along. And so for her privacy, we'll call her Ray for today. And so as a placement specialist and as a family therapist in the Tacoma area, Ray, can you just talk a little bit about what you do and, share whatever you'd like about foster care and who you are and your role and stuff?
Yes. So I will just start by saying foster care is a very complex and confusing system, or the foster care system is not just in our state, but in the nation in general. It is managed by the state, though, so I work within DCYF, which is overseen by the state of Washington. And my particular roles, I do 2 things. One is I am in charge of placing children in foster homes or with foster caregivers. And that means when a child comes in through CPS, so there is a founded allegation of abuse or neglect, the state worker, so a CPS worker, will remove that child from the home, sometimes with law enforcement involved, and will need to find a home for the child, and they will contact me, and I manage within my agency. So the state worker will contact me, and I am in charge of about 200 homes that I know of, and I will get some information about the child, their age, typically their race, typically some information about their personality, or some if they have any medical issues. Those are made known to me as best they can. This happens really quick, so it is an imperfect process. And then I will look at the homes I have available, and I will try to make the best fit in terms of which caregiver would be a good fit for the child. I try as best I can to find a cultural match for the kiddo, as well as just to consider other children that are in the home, or the caregiver's ability to meet the needs of that specific child. So I do that all within typically the same day, and sometimes within a few hours. There are some exceptions to that, but it happens pretty quickly. Then I do that just a couple days a week, and the rest of my days in the week I wear multiple hats at the agency I work for, but I am a therapist. So I work with families in the system, and this can be a birth family who's had their children removed from their home, or this could be a foster family, or I also work with families who have adopted a child through the foster care system. And I will go into their homes and I will provide therapy. It's not mental health services. I'm not working with the diagnosis and trying to treat that, but I am working with the family to alleviate some things that might be going on in the home that are considered problems for that family. They consider problems. Or if I'm working with birth families, sometimes I'm also assigned to help a family understand some safety measures that they need to put in place before their children can be returned. Or I facilitate, if a child is returning to the parent, just that process and try to help them build that attachment in a healthy, good way and be a support to the parent.
That's awesome. Can you talk a little bit just about the history of the foster care system?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
How it came to be?
Yeah, so we were talking, Rachel and I, about structure, the structure of the foster care system and the history. To give you some insight, foster care really began in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, and then early 1900s it really developed. And basically they trace the start back to this man named Charles Brace. And he began the free foster home movement, which was a movement he created out of New York. He was a minister and a director of the New York Children's Aid Society. He was concerned about the large number of immigrant children sleeping in the streets of New York, and he came up with a plan to provide them homes by advertising in the South and the West for families willing to provide free homes for these children, whether it was for charitable reasons or to help these children. So he kind of recruited families to do that. Okay. This, long story short, became a part of the larger state system. Eventually, the state recognized this need, and so during the early 1900s, social agencies began to supervise foster parents. Records were kept, trying to make sure that this was actually safe and that this was benefiting the children. Children's individual needs were considered when placements were made at that point, and the federal government began supporting state inspections of foster homes. And services were provided to birth families, or natural families, some people call it, to enable the child to return home to those families. And foster parents were seen as part of a professional team working to find permanency for dependent children, meaning foster parents weren't being looked to as the ultimate place for children to land, but they were kind of this temporary home while these other families work to make sure their living conditions were safe and were healthy for the child, and then the child would return back to those families. So that's the history and basically how the structure began.
So I think a lot of us are really familiar with this idea of orphans. Mm-hmm. Can you just describe for us the difference between a foster kid and an orphan?
Yes. Yeah, that's actually, if I could say it's a trigger word, that's maybe a trigger word within the foster care system, because orphan specifically speaks to children who don't have parents. So either those parents have passed away or are missing. That is rarely the case in foster care. In foster care, these children who are removed from their homes, they very much have parents. Or a parent or a caregiver that they were with before that they often are really aligned to. And these children often, a big misconception is that these children want to be removed because they're afraid of their homes. Often children's removal from their home that's deemed unsafe or unhealthy is actually the biggest trauma they incur coming into foster care. Mm-hmm. So we don't use the term orphans because these children have parents, and our goal is to return them to parents. And there is this connotation that orphans don't have parents, and there are orphans, but foster children are in a different category. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. And we don't have orphanages. That's another misconception. In the United States, there are no orphanages. There are in other countries, but we have sometimes group homes for foster children. But
what's the difference between a group home and an orphanage?
That's a great question. Group homes, again, are for foster children. So in an orphanage, the goal would be that child would eventually be adopted out of the orphanage. and land with a family who's not their biological family or not a relative, and live with that family forever. A group home is sometimes a facility. That's kind of a cold word, but it's a facility that hosts multiple foster children, but the goal is still that that child returns to their family. So we don't have a group home where in the United States where people are coming to adopt a child from a group home necessarily.
Right.
We're still trying to work on that reunification.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's very helpful. Well, thank you for that. Let's transition a little bit. And can you talk about, just in your 2 roles, in the multiple hats that you wear, what are some of the limitations that you've noticed, and areas maybe where you do have power and then some where maybe you don't?
Okay, that's a great question. We'll start with therapy, my therapeutic role. My background is actually in therapy. So before I worked in the foster care system, I was a therapist. And coming into the foster care system, one thing that was very different was I did therapy like I had done before, but this time it was mandated, meaning that I was assigned a family not because they had asked for therapy necessarily, but because a social worker who works with them directly and is either working on reunification, or maybe the social worker is working with a foster family that they see the need for, the social worker is the one who initiates my service. So what this means is I immediately, already as a therapist, you come into working with families in a position of power. And even if that's not your heart or that's not your philosophy, you don't want to be seen as the person in a position of power. You are, and that's something you have to acknowledge working with any family. However, it especially is felt when you are working within the foster care system because, again, this family is mandated to see me and they have to complete my services, especially if I'm working with a birth family or a natural family. There's this need for them to, quote unquote, successfully complete my service. And everything I do with every family I'm working with gets reported to a social worker. And that social worker is involved in their case. And their case is what determines whether or not their children can return to them, or whether that child is not going to be able to return to their family of origin. So I might be making this a little bit complex, but I want you to know those pieces, to know that when I enter a home as a therapeutic resource, these families often are suspicious of me. They know that my word holds a lot of weight. So the biggest, most important part of a therapeutic role is that you're able to build a genuine, trusted relationship with a family. But that is a big barrier because it's hard to build a trusted relationship with a family when they know that everything they're saying or doing, or they believe everything they're saying or doing is getting reported to the social worker. Yeah. Now, my reports are pretty minimal. I just go in and I say, hey, this is the service I provided. This family either showed up or they didn't. But regardless, I'm eyes in that home, and it's kind of a scary thing for families. So yes, I am in a position of power. But one place where I don't have power as a therapist is I am actually not a legal party to the case. So this can work in 2 ways. I can really think that when I'm working with this family that this parent maybe that I'm working with is going to really be able to parent this child well, and I think that reunification should happen and should happen fast. That might be my opinion. And that opinion doesn't really hold a lot of weight. It's really up to the social worker and then the legal parties involved to make that decision. And then the reverse can be true. Maybe I'm seeing that, okay, this parent isn't ready for a return home, and I'm not seeing that safety or health measures are being fulfilled, and I could be hesitant, but ultimately what I'm seeing in the home doesn't hold weight in court. It's up to the social worker, so I'll report to the social worker. And truly, when I'm in the therapeutic role, it is not my heart to determine whether or not a family is fit for reunification or how quickly. But if that were to come up or that were to be something I'm noticing, I'm not presenting that in any legal way. Right. So it's very confusing. I hope you can kind of understand. But so I have power with the family. And then when it comes to the system I'm working with, I have very little power.
Wow.
So there are all these layers of hierarchy that happen within the foster care system that are very complicated. And I am somewhere in that middle range of power.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
In your placement role, how does that play out?
In my placement role, I actually do feel that I have it is a very important responsibility, I believe. And I do believe that I would say, if I'm comparing the two roles, I have more power in that role. Mm-hmm. Because I know the families that I am placing kids with, and the state doesn't know those families. So my agency has licensed those families, vetted those families. I have basically a small little book on who they are. I have mm-hmm. talked to them. I have a relationship with them, and I am the one who is determining whether a child can go into that home. And that's a huge decision for that child, a huge decision for that family. And I don't often experience interference from the state in that. They trust that because of our process that we're able to make that placement fit. And so when I do work with the state to learn about the child, but if I say, hey, I have this home and it's available and I think it'd be a good fit, I most often get the okay to make that move. It's not a legal decision, mm-hmm. again, but it is a very important decision in that kid's life.
Yeah, it sounds like you do not take that role lightly and that power, that authority lightly. Can you describe some ways in which you practice wielding, I guess is the word, mm-hmm. that power in a way that is equitable, mm-hmm. in a way that is considering the most marginalized mm-hmm. that you work with?
Yes. And I will be frank in saying that it is very imperfect, because the very common thread of foster care and children coming into dependency, so the common thread that I see across the board is poverty. Mm. I'm really struggling to think of a family who comes from a middle-class culture whose child is placed in foster care. And the reason why that is because foster care, meaning with someone who's not their relative, mm-hmm. Because there are all kinds of barriers that come into play. I'm going to try to maybe make this simple, because again, it can get complicated, that come into play. And one of which is for a child to move into a home of a relative, that relative has to have a pretty clean or clear criminal background. And they also have to have the financial means to support that child. And the people who are determining whether or not that relative has the financial means, that's the state. And so those two things mean that often if you are in poverty culture, the family and friends around you often, I use the term poverty culture because it is a specific culture, and it is something to be considered when placing kids. But the people around you also might not have the financial means to support that child. So instead of being placed with someone, let's say if I was a parent and my kids were being removed from my home, whether I feel it's unjust or just that they're being removed, often those kids are not going to go to people who are familiar to me, who I know. And so that child, someone writes up a bio about them, and then that bio comes to me, and I'm placing that child in a home of strangers. And these strangers often come from a different culture. Maybe they're from a different town. Moving a kid from Tacoma to Eatonville, that's a really big change mm-hmm. for that child, and that is a cultural change. Mm-hmm. That's rural culture versus a more urban culture. So a lot of times I'm placing these kids as best I can in something that's a match. So I'm considering the cultural fit, meaning whether that be rural or urban setting. If a child comes from poverty culture and I'm placing them with a family who is upper middle class, there are going to be some differences in the way that interactions happen between those families or expectations.
Yeah, it's very clear to me that within the system, there are other systems interwoven, and you'll talk a little bit more about the race piece of that. But when we talk about poverty in and of itself is a system that has been informed by history, right? And in our class, we've talked a lot about the ways, after watching the movie 13th, the ways in which slavery impacted poverty, right? And so all of those things start to like ricochet and inform one another. So it doesn't surprise me then that this system of foster care directly affects those that are living in poverty, and as you'll talk about, certain populations more than others who have historically been oppressed by different means, and so as particularly people of color that have been affected by systems far beyond slavery, even before that. So
absolutely, and that is really well said. I think that is my experience within the system. So as we kind of dial into some of those barriers that you brought up, can you talk about just the confusion that can come about and maybe the gaps? Because what I'm hearing from you is that because the system is so confusing and there are so many people that are involved in the system, not only is there confusion, but it sounds to me like there is a lot of room for gaps and like things to fall through the cracks, basically. And so can you just talk briefly about that? I know it's probably a larger topic than what we have time for, but could you just share? So yes, the system is huge, and there is a ton of communication going on between multiple parties that are involved in one case. So let's just look at one case, for example. So every family is going to have a social worker assigned, at least one social worker, and that person's in charge of getting parents or caregivers connected to services they need to complete before that family is deemed ready to receive their children back. So the social worker is in charge of that, and they're also in charge of making sure the child who's placed in a foster home is safe. And that social worker is in charge of they're the liaison between this family and the court. But with that social worker, there's an attorney. So the social worker communicates what's going on to the attorney, and the attorney is an AG for the state, and they will report together in court on how that family is doing. Most often, there is a guardian ad litem assigned. And for lack of better terms for this, or not for lack of better terms, but this is not as expansive of a definition as I'd like, but basically that guardian ad litem is an advocate for the child. So they're another set of eyes in the home that is trying to identify which placement would be best for the child. And so that guardian ad litem reports as well to the court. And then each parent or caregiver is assigned an attorney. This attorney is funded through the state. It's basically like a defense attorney defending that caregiver or making sure that their voice is heard in court. And then there's a judge, and that judge is the one making decisions on whether or not these children can be reunified to their parents. So right there are several people involved. And these people are constantly trying to communicate to each other, but they have different agendas. And it gets complicated just in the communication that goes on there. And then even what they're communicating to the families. So some families are in dependency, some caregivers, and they really don't know what's going on. They don't know what's going on with their children. They're trying to figure it out. They don't know what the state expects of them. And so sometimes there's just lack of clarity because the communication gets a little murky, for lack of better terms. Yeah. So that is simple. And then on top of all those layers, we have the greater DCYF, which is the Department of Child, Youth, and Families. And there is, that is a very large system that is also involved in all these decisions.
And then every state in and of themselves has their own system.
Yeah.
So that, what you're describing is how we function in Washington State, but that might be different in Idaho or Oregon.
Yes, I would say the framework is similar. the agenda is different. So they will have similar assignments for social workers, guardian ad litems, and things like that, but the agenda of that state might be different. Washington's agenda, so to speak, they say is ultimately to reunify kids to their caregivers. That is what we see as being actually the best outcome for kids, and there's research behind that. So a lot of the momentum is about trying to make sure that reunification can happen and that we really are enabling that. Some states don't prioritize reunification as much. So does that make sense? The agenda is different.
Yeah.
Even if the structure is similar.
Yeah, that's good. Can you talk about a little bit about those degrees of separation?
Yeah.
Between decision makers and families and the role of subjectivity in that?
Yes. Maybe we'll start with the roles of subjectivity, and I'll talk about the degrees of separation. I do want to make sure I highlight that the piece that you're speaking about oppression, specifically of people of color within this system. So in foster care, I don't feel like I've touched upon this as much, but the United States has a long history of separating children, especially Black, Latinx, Native American children from their families. And there was a report in 2018 that there were over 400,000 children in foster care, and that's a 10% increase from 2012. So there are a lot of kids in foster care, which is also part of this large system.
Right.
And a majority of the children removed by child welfare systems were taken because of neglect. Neglect is a little less clear than physical abuse or sexual abuse. When either physical abuse or sexual abuse has occurred, it's a little bit clearer that this child needs to be removed. And even for that child, it's a little bit clearer why they were removed. So let's say if the child's like 9, 10, 11, the state can say, hey, you were removed because you were physically abused or you were sexually abused, and that's not okay. So that's a more clear removal.
Mm-hmm.
Neglect is a little bit more confusing. Speaking about subjectivity can come into play when we're identifying neglect. And it's a label that a lot of people believe can too easily be applied to parents living in poverty. The removal of children, which is done in the name of the protection of the child, often leads them to be placed in foster care systems, like we said. And there is that can be a challenge for the child in and of itself. But what is seen as neglect can be lack of running water in a home, inability to feed children properly, the way the state sees it to be proper, inability to care for the child. So sometimes you have a caregiver who is a working parent, and they are just trying to get food on the table and trying to meet the most basic needs of their children. Maybe they're leaving their kid home, and their kid's young, and maybe too young in the state's opinion to be left home. So that is considered a neglect case. That child can be removed even when what the parent is doing is just really trying to meet the basic needs of the child. So do you see how subjectivity could come into play when it comes to neglect?
Absolutely. It sounds like subjectivity is in fact the doorway to oppression. So maybe there's not the intent to oppress in mind, but because subjectivity is involved and you're allowed to make a decision based on your opinion, it just makes room for bias. Yeah. It leaves a lot of room for bias.
And this is why I used the term poverty culture before, because a lot of the ideas about what is safe and what is healthy come from a middle class majority perspective. So
even the things that inform the system, like you're describing neglect, even the things that inform the system are biased.
Are based off of, middle class majority culture opinion.
Wow. So
there is some acknowledgement of that happening in the state and more over time, but it's really slow. And it's
systems can be. Mm-hmm.
And so in poverty culture, for example, relationship is really valued, and in looking out for the people who are a part of your family, a part of your greater family unit. And So I'm trying to think of a good example of this. I work with a family who, it's an aunt who's a caregiver, and she, her home, she's renting an apartment. It's unstable. She is financially trying to meet the rent requirements every month, but it's a little unstable. She knows that if she were to be kicked out of her apartment, she could go and live with her cousin, and she could bring this child with her cousin. Her cousin has an apartment, has space and they can support the needs of the child. But she might not be able to financially afford that apartment, right? So she might need to utilize her family member. Well, this family member might have, again, I'm trying to make this simple. I think I'm making it more complex, but this family member might have a check in their criminal background from when they were 18. Something minor, but they have a criminal record. Well, if there are eyes from the state involved in this case, that aunt can't move in with that resource of this cousin who would be able to support them. And so all of a sudden she, a big part of her support system isn't available because the state is involved.
Right.
So there are all kinds of nuances basically to how to deem whether a child is safe in the home, and it's really complicated.
Yeah. It's a very tangled web, it sounds like.
Yeah, it is. And so subjectivity does play a huge role. And who are the subjective people who have subjective opinions that hold a lot of weight? That's the social worker. That's the judge. Sometimes the judge is the ultimate decision maker. And we talk on here about degrees of separation. The judge is not in the home with these families. The judge is hearing reports from a social worker, an attorney, a guardian ad litem, and the parent's attorney. And they're doing the best they can, but again, there is some perspective influencing their decision, and some personal perspective influencing their decision. And as unbiased as we try to be with the law, we know that the law isn't always as unbiased as we would like it to be. Yeah. So it's just complicated, and hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really helpful. So really quick, I just would I'll run through these vocabulary pieces, and maybe you could touch on anything that you'd like to expand on, Ray. And so number one, what is a social worker? It's a profession concerned with helping individuals, families, groups, and communities to enhance their individual and collective well-being. Is there anything you wanted to add to that piece?
That is well said.
Okay, well put. And what we know too is that social workers don't just work in foster care; they work in a lot of different spaces, and they really at the center of things are really just geared toward enhancing the well-being of individuals and communities. And so we are very thankful for social workers. Placement is this transition piece of a child from one home to the next. And so that might be from an unsafe home into a safe home, and then from a short-term home into a long-term home, depending on how long that child is in foster care. The Department of Children, Youth, and Families is the cabinet-level agency focused on the well-being of children. So that is run by the state of Washington. Dependency court. Can you talk a little bit about that, Ray?
Yes. I just do really want to clarify that dependency court is involved in the family court system. So it's not civil law and it's not criminal. So these cases aren't going to go on someone's criminal background. It's also not civil, which that's involved with two private parties. So those are really, really different things. Family court is unique. It sits in a really unique place. So just the takeaway is that a family who's in the midst of dependency, that's then that you get a criminal background check on that person. It's not going to flag that, they're in the middle of a dependency hearing with their kid.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
That's very helpful.
Okay.
So
they are in charge of making sure families are safe and operating in a way that's beneficial to the child. The child is really the one that we have in mind more so than the adult in dependency court.
And that's where they're determining where the child will go. Is that what dependency court is for?
Ultimately, yes.
Okay.
The dependency court is reviewing, every 6 months they're reviewing whether or not this parent or caregiver who has had their child removed, whether they're engaging in services that will help make amends basically for the things that were going on in the home that were seen as unsafe. So a lot of times that's substance abuse treatment. Substance abuse plays a big role in these cases. So they're doing UAs, which urinary analysis. They are participating in a substance abuse treatment program. Maybe they're doing some parenting classes. Maybe they are working with a therapist to learn how to discipline a child in a way that's safe and healthy and beneficial to the child. So the parent has to be participating in these processes, or caregiver does, and the court is reporting on that every 6 months. And if they're making progress and they are completing their programs and they are articulating that, okay, they're changing some of the things that they had done in the home previously, then that child will be returned home. Okay. And that if the parent or caregiver is said to not be doing those things and they determine that in court, then ultimately the child could potentially move into adoption, which is not the heart of not the heart of the state, not the heart of anyone in this field. Honestly, I think the heart is that kids will be reunified to their families.
And we make families whole.
Yeah.
That's the goal. Yeah. That's awesome. And then the last piece is subjectivity, which we talked a lot about, but it's this quality of being based on or influenced by personal feelings, tastes, or opinions.
Just real quick to step in. I don't know, do you guys ever talk about the difference between intent and impact?
I would love for you to share a bit about that.
So I do want to clarify that I think the state, if we're giving everyone the benefit of the doubt here, right? The state, the social worker, the guardian ad litem, the attorney, the birth parents and caregivers, the foster parents, the intent of all those entities is that we are keeping children safe and in healthy places and connected ultimately to their families of origin. That is the intent behind everything we do. Now, because we have opinions and biases, sometimes the way we're interpreting things is different based off of our own biases. So there is some subjectivity in that. So the impact of the decision we make, even if our intent is for the ultimate well-being and safety of the child, sometimes we're making decisions, and sometimes we make decisions that are wrong at the end of the day and that don't work. And so the impact is actually different than what the intent. So our impact might be that we aren't making the healthiest decision for the child, and the impact on that child is that they aren't in the healthiest place for them, even though our intent was to do it. So does that make sense? Another way to talk about this is, I don't know if I can think of another way to talk about this.
No, I think that's great.
But just because your intent is good doesn't mean that the impact of what you're doing
absolutely matches
that.
Absolutely.
And that's true across the board, with oppression especially. When we think of
well, we think about it too. I mean, we talked about earlier this week this idea of civil discourse. And when you're having a conversation with somebody and they have an opinion and you have an opinion and you don't know that what story and what experience and what values are informing that opinion. Instead, you're just rubbing two opinions up against each other that might feel opposing. And so when we talk about intent versus impact, the intent of the person who has that particular opinion might be one thing, but the impact that it has on you because of your lived experience is different.
Way to summarize that. That's perfect.
Yeah, I know. I think that's really important as we consider this. So foundational takeaways, and Ray, feel free to jump in. But number one, the stated objective of foster care in Washington State, I should specify, is to reunify families if at all possible. The second piece is the state where the child is held is the quote-unquote parent of that child while they are in care. The state is the main power holder in this context.
Yeah, and even though foster parents have the right to take kids to medical appointments, to make educational decisions for them, they have to get that approved through the state. So ultimately the state is actually the parent, and the foster caregiver is an arm of that.
Okay. that is helpful. And to note that the foster parent doesn't really have as much power and authority as we might think.
They have no legal power at all.
Okay. That's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the third takeaway is that children from Latinx, Black, and Native American populations are vastly overrepresented in the foster care system, and they are also more unlikely to be adopted.
Or
right.
More likely to.
They are more likely to be adopted.
Well, yeah.
More unlikely to be reunified. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's helpful.
And I don't have particular stats on that. I know there are some stats out there, so you might be able to send those off to your students. And I just didn't get a document in time to support that statement. But yes, and but
that's based on your experience too, right?
Yeah, anecdotally, that's absolutely true. I will also say that population is underrepresented in foster caregivers. So foster parents are vastly majority culture, from a majority culture, and so that's complicated when we talk about making placements and making cultural matches, and racial matches and things like that, which we try to do. We try to find a family that's familiar for that child, that looks like them, that's from a familiar place, because that does help, because ultimately they're being united with strangers. Yeah. And but that is really hard to do when a large majority of our foster parents are white, middle class, rural. I mean, that's a huge portion of the population I work with is white, middle class, and rural. Wow. Which is unique. Yeah. I do want to say to that too that that there are a lot of reasons why that population is more likely to be involved in foster care. Mm-hmm. I think there's distrust a lot with the system for many people. It's hard to trust this big entity of the state. And there are some things in place for how foster parents are vetted, and this is complicated, and you can look into this yourself, that make it easier if you're from a majority culture to be approved to be a foster parent. So that's really challenging. And
it's definitely an example of the ways that privilege functions in the system.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we didn't talk at all about ICWA, but there is this big entity. I know you're going to send out some information on that. Indian Child Welfare Act. I forget the date that started, but there are some things that we have in place to try to address that disparity. ICWA being one of them. And yet it still very much exists.
Yeah. That's helpful though to know.
Yeah. And that's just with Native American kids that we have ICWA in place. And there's no other entity like that with any other populations.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Wow. That's really helpful. Thank you, Ray. So this is where we're going to wrap up this conversation. Thank you so much, Ray, for joining us today and being willing to answer some interview questions about the system of foster care. I think that, even I learned a whole bunch about the system, and so really appreciate you being willing to share. And for you students at home, our class discussion questions today are listed here. And so you'll just navigate to Microsoft Teams and then posts, and I'll have the questions posted there. And I'm eager to hear your responses. So the first question is, who currently has power and privilege in the foster care system? So based on our discussion today with Ray, what did you notice? And where do power and privilege lie? Number 2, who is subject to systemic oppression? And there were several people groups that Ray mentioned, and so make sure that you go back and you listen for those. And number 3, what needs to change in the system? What do you notice could change? And if we're putting on our dreaming hat, how can it be changed? What are some ways in which it can change? And then for your journal question, so that you're going to navigate to Microsoft Teams class notebook and then go to your personal notebook, and under the tab listed journal, I want you to answer these 4 questions. 1, are there any human rights violations within the foster care system that you notice? And by human rights violations, I mean when we talk about what you value as a human right, where do you notice those being violated within the existing foster care system? Number 2, how does the system connect to you personally? Do you know anybody that's been affected by the foster care system? How does the current state of the system make you feel? Number 3, how can your future ambitions connect with the foster care system and those marginalized within it? And then the last piece is I'd like you to read the policy handout that I'll have added into our files section on Teams. And what do you notice about the changes in child welfare policy over time? There have been a lot of legal there's been a lot of legal movement and policy change over time within the child welfare system in the United States, including ICWA that Ray talked about. And so I want you to take a look at some of those and tell me what you noticed. And that will conclude our class for today. Thank you all so much for being here, and I look forward to our next class and hopefully seeing you again in person.